Interviewing. Today is the first in a series of 4 webinars being sponsored by the Eastern and Western PA Balance of State Continuums of Care. In addition to today's webinar on motivational interviewing, the second webinar will occur next Wednesday from 1 to 3 on harm reduction, on April 18th from 1 to 3, Introduction to Trauma-Informed Care, and then lastly on May 9th from 1 to 3, Working with Opioid Use Disorders. These webinars, the themes and the topics were really driven by the feedback that we heard from you all after last year's webinars and face-to-face trainings that occurred on Housing First. I know that in both of those, there was a lot of talk about the concepts of motivational interviewing, harm reduction, trauma-informed care, et cetera. And we really felt like those concepts needed to be further explored and additional training being provided around those specific techniques. So thank you to both COC governing boards for continuing to put planning grant dollars towards providing ongoing and additional training to our COCs and members and partners. And I just want to go ahead and let folks know that we have not sent out a save the date yet, but we'll be getting this together very shortly. We're still looking to lock in some locations, but our trainers will also be providing a face-to-face training on housing-focused case management. This will be really a very interactive day designed to help sort of integrate these concepts into practice. The trainings will occur on May 21st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th, and they're going to move from east to west across the state. So we're going to start somewhere around the Lehigh Valley, Pocono area, move to central, Harrisburg area, next to Northwest, and then finally on the 24th in the Southwest region. Like I said, we're still looking to lock in a couple of training locations, and once we have that, hopefully in the next week or so, we will have the save the date out and a registration link out specifically for the case management training. So with that, I just want to turn things over to our 2 presenters from Pathway to Housing PA Training Institute, Matt and Oksana. Welcome and thank you very much. Just to let everybody know, there will be time for question at the end. So I hope that you can continue to use, throughout the webinar the text box, and you can feel free to submit questions throughout the entire presentation. And then if you would prefer to ask your question to the trainers directly, just raise your hand at that appropriate time, and Brendan can unmute your line, which will allow you to ask your question. Thanks, everybody.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lee. This is Matt Tice, and I'm going to hand it over to Oksana in just a moment. Unfortunately, we had a little bit of technical difficulty, so it might be a little bit awkward as we're going to be handing our headset back and forth to each other through the presentation, but we'll make it work. We're so excited to be here and doing this webinar with you, and I think this is going to be a great opportunity to be able to build on some of these technical skills that Lee had noted in related to Housing First, related to the things that so many people had mentioned that they're very interested in bringing into their own practice further and further, and then building on it later on in the face-to-face trainings, where we're going to do a lot more interaction, a lot more practical and experiential types of activities. And a lot of that is going to be very informed by the questions, the types of feedback that you give to us. So please help us by defining those things. Keep your questions as we go along. Just to note, we actually are not going to do the unmuting feature. We're actually just going to be doing questions based on by typing And so our host is going to help us do that, and he's going to dictate those questions over to us in the end. And so you'll be able to type those questions to us. And you can do that throughout the presentation, but we're going to take them at the very end. So just to move on real quick to a little bit about the two of us. So I'm the clinical director at Pathways to Housing PA. So Pathways to Housing PA is a housing first organization. It's one of the first organizations as Pathways in general to offer housing first across the entire country for specializing in what this is for working with chronically homeless individuals transitioning out of chronic homelessness and severe mental illness, severe addiction, excuse me. And so I've been doing this for a number of years. I love this work. I've actually been able to work on the clinical teams for a number of years before I transitioned over into leadership. And I still love the opportunity to be able to work really closely with our team members, with our participants, doing advocacy, looking at how to be able to connect both the community aspects with also the individual practice too. Oksana is our assistant clinical director, so she also comes from a long history of therapeutic background, of being able to support participants through therapy and counseling. And so then she was able to bring that over into our Housing First practice, and she also does a lot of work with our compliance, our CQI work, and then supporting other agencies too in how to help do Housing First work in general. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Oksana to get us going on motivational interviewing.
Hi, everyone. We would like to start with sharing that motivational interviewing is really more of a philosophical approach rather than a set of techniques and interventions. You really, really have to believe in motivational interviewing as a way of being with people. You have to embrace motivational interviewing and kind of incorporate it into your work frame as a philosophical approach and believe in its efficacy. No techniques, no interventions or tools will be effective if you really don't buy into this particular approach. So it's one thing to take away from this slide is really more of a belief, a way of relating to people, a way of treating people rather than kind of dishing out techniques, interventions, and tools. So change and motivation, the two intertwine. Without the motivation, there is going to be no change. And what change is, we often wonder, like, why people don't change. We often ask ourselves questions. It would be so easy for you just to stop drinking, or why don't you just get into an apartment and get off the streets? Your life would be so much better. So these questions we often ask without really pondering upon what is it that the person is motivated by to make this change. So we really have to look at why the change, not really at the reasons why change doesn't happen, but the reasons why change takes place. So, and for change to occur, there has to be a motivation on the person's end. One thing to note, motivation is not something that you can impose or force onto people. However, you can promote motivation by using a certain set of techniques, by building a relationship with that person, by offering options and exploring and elaborating. That's something that can be promoted. However, you can never force or push motivation. So motivation has a few critical components, and the three of them that we really wanted to look at is willingness, readiness, and ability. In other words, for motivation to take place, you have to be willing. You have to want to change a particular behavior. Not only you have to want to change a behavior, you really have to be ready. You have to be ready to make this change now, not 10 years from now, not 5 years from now. It has to be happening in the current time. And do you really have the ability, the supports, the resources to make this change? So those three components come together, intertwine, and they really make motivation to be successful. As I said before, motivation and change kind of go hand in hand, and we do have to remember that change has to happen at its own pace, and it happens as a process, not a one-time event. It's not like you took the person off the streets, moved them into an apartment today, and that's it, their life is much better already, the change happened. It is really a process, and it evolves over time. And again, something that you cannot force onto someone. A behavior change or any change really happens, and a person gets this commitment to change when that person connects this change with something that's really important to them. It has to have a strong value to them. So you may have a person who again, I'm going to use the example of a homeless person who continues to stay on the streets, who chooses to be on the streets, and they may see that as value to them. They may see their level of independence connected to being homeless because they're not tied to any particular addresses. They may not be tied to having to pay bills and so forth. So understanding where that person is coming from when they make the choices that they make is really important. And we really have to remember to think and ask, like, how is this important to that person, and kind of dig into their value system a little bit. You do want to make sure that your own beliefs and value systems do not really interfere with the work that you're doing with the client. It's pretty common or easy for us to have these values that, for instance, for me, my value might be like, I really need to stay healthy. Health is like #1 priority for me. But for that same person living on the streets, the health might not be the priority for them. It might be, again, remaining independent and mobile might be something that's really important to them. So you don't want to push your agenda. You don't want to impose your own values. You really have to hear the person out, hear where they're coming from, understand their values, and then start working from there.
You also want to think really carefully about how a lot of our systems work from a more of a punitive or a threat response. And these tend to inhibit change. So motivational interviewing as a process is trying to think of other ways to be an alternative to that. When we act more aggressive or punitive impositions towards change, these things tend to be much less effective. And confrontation, you think about it for yourself. When someone is coming at you, or they're, even in a conversation with your spouse or someone else, that a loved one, there's much more likelihood that you're going to push in, that you're going to you're going to dig in your heels, and there will be resistance. So the same is true for the participants that we serve, that the more we push back, the more that we are exhibiting some of these authority figures or some of these authority actions, then we're going to have less likelihood to be able to elicit that support. Also, a lot of times all across the board in mental health, in shelters, in any of the systems that we're interacting with, people get labeled all of the time. And labeling is much more likely to increase denial. It's much more likely to push back and say, I don't want to be able to look at this issue, or interact with this person that's already putting me in a box. And so instead, let's allow people to determine what is important to them, how they're really determining their own destiny, their own values, and then forcing short-term change also is ineffective. Let's push them into a box in the short term, but we're looking more along the lines of sustainability. And a lot of times, housing first and some of the other principles of harm reduction, which we're going to get into next week too, more in depth, is that this is playing the long game. These are incremental changes, that they're processes that last people's whole lives. And finally, hanging the consequences over someone's head just for the sake of consequences, not for something that they're invested in themselves, doesn't tend to work. And so it really has to be a thing that they believe in, that they feel like that is an actual important thing that they want to avoid, as opposed to something that's just being imposed from the outside. A few things, and we're going to kind of do a bit of a comparison of what fits within the spirit of motivational interviewing and the non-traditional or non-motivational interviewing and traditional approach. And they look a little bit like this. So in collaboration, we have much more of a partnership. This is about forming a relationship, and that bond, that therapeutic alliance, or this relationship that you can form with the people that you're working with, is so key. But instead, a lot of times, traditionally, what we come from is a confrontation perspective. We're imposing an acceptance of a reality that the participant cannot see. You are denying this. I'm the authority. I'm the person who knows what's happening here, and you just need to figure it out. Well, again, this is going to be another place where a person's going to push in their heels and not be able to see that themselves. The other end is also evocation. So recognizing that motivation and resources really, for change, are presumed to reside already within the client, the participant. It's not, on the other end, like education, that it's all coming from us as the folks with the degree, with the experience. Oftentimes, for those of us who are in recovery, where we can say that, you know, I've walked this road, or I've been through this, I've lived this or that, and I made it out, or I've survived this. And so you should too, because you've also had these. If it worked for me, it'll work for you. But instead, what we're trying to say is there are resources inside of you. How can we help draw these out? And that it's presumed already that they are there. Finally, some of the other things within the spirit of motivational interviewing is autonomy. So we really want to be able to empower their own right or their own ability to make their own directions. Set the goals, set the course, as opposed to authority-based, where the counselor or the practitioner, the worker, is setting the path. It's all determined by me. I know exactly where to go because I've seen this work for everybody else, or I know that this is what they taught me in school, or this is what my supervisor says. But really, a person should be able to have the freedom to make their own choices, and then we can affirm them in that choice.
So I know many of you have heard the term empathy, and I know we use it a lot, specifically social workers, and just wanted to really kind of put a different spin on it when it comes to motivational interviewing. When they talk empathy, empathy is an ability, your ability to walk in the client's shoes, meaning that your ability to see, to understand and comprehend where the client mindset is, where they're coming from, why certain things are important to them and why certain things are not important to them. So your ability is to basically see where the client is and kind of walk in their shoes, right? So with a motivational interviewing, there's an underlying principle of empathy, and that is acceptance. What that means is accepting the client's perspective without judgment, without criticism, and without blame is almost like very closely tied to the unconditional regard of Roger's perspective, when you are able to unconditionally accept this client's perspective, whether you agree with it or not. One thing to note, acceptance does not mean automatically that you agree with a client's perspective. You might have a disagreement. Say if the client chooses to continue smoking cigarettes, despite the fact that the doctor recommends quitting smoking, you will have to accept that perspective, that client's perspective, but not necessarily agree that that's the best decision, right? So you're not imposing your opinion and values on the client is really important. One little concept which is pretty big in motivational interviewing is reflective listening, and it's extremely important that you do this reflective listening a lot. We're going to talk a little bit more in detail about it later in the presentation, but reflective listening is basically repeating to the client what you understand them telling you. You're letting them know that you heard them, you understood what they're saying, and it's very closely tied to being empathetic and being acceptant of the client. We do want to acknowledge that ambivalence is a normal part of change, and it's not something that we should see as pathological, or this person is ambivalent, don't they just get it? Wouldn't they be better off living in an apartment than having to live on the streets, especially in the cold weather? So ambivalence, it's a person's, again, we're going to talk more about it later in detail, it's this person's kind of hesitancy. Should I make a change? I want to make a change, but I don't really want to make a change. It's kind of being on the fence here. So that's normal. It's considered non-pathological again. With developing discrepancy. So discrepancy arises when you have a client engaging in a particular behavior, but they have a goal that's opposite of that behavior. Let's say, for example, you may have a client who chooses to remain homeless, but their goal, this is not your goal, it's their goal that they want to get into an apartment. However, every appointment that you make with them, every effort to follow up, they might not show up, or they refuse to sign paperwork and so forth. So their behaviors might be kind of contradictory to what they said they want to do. And as someone who is motivational interviewing sensitive, you don't really want to kind of throw it back at them. You don't want to challenge them, but your goal is to kind of help them see that, hey, what you're doing is kind of contradicting to where you said you want to be, but you want to help them see and understand that by eliciting change talk, by asking the right kind of questions that we're, again, going to talk a little bit more in detail later in the presentation. I know I don't want to say everyone, but most of you heard this word resistance. I even nowadays hear practitioners use term resistance. They say, oh, this client is resistant. They didn't show up again for my sessions, or they're refusing to take medications. They're non-compliant and resistant. So we do tend to use this word a lot, but within motivational interviewing, the idea is really recognize that there is going to be what they call resistance. There is going to be that, and you have to embrace it, not try to minimize it, not try to avoid it. You really have to acknowledge the fact that the client may not be doing everything that we had agreed upon initially. And one thing I really want to encourage each one of you to think about is whenever there is a resistance, it's probably a signal for you to start doing something differently and to respond differently to the client. Again, the more we push, the bigger wall that they're going to put up. Another very important principle of motivational interviewing is this belief that the client has a responsibility to make this change. The client is the one that can make the change, and they are the ones that, and no one else can do it for them. They have, like Matt was saying earlier, they have this innate strength and innate strengths that will help them make this change. So if you believe that, you're most likely to start building on those strengths. And if you automatically are the type that looks at what's wrong with the person and start pointing out the deficits, it's going to be hard to really support the person's self-efficacy if you already believe that they don't have it.
If I can quick jump back on this other slide too, this kind of a tongue-in-cheek in our clip art here too, because it's you know, to one sense, looking at this little picture here, it could actually feel pretty offensive, and if you were to put that through and say that this is here's your participant, here's your worker. Our point in putting this here is actually that is not the case. This is not how we want to be treating our relationships. Let's not try and be treating our participants like they're you know, other than, and that we need to be pulling them along, and you know, is all our control. So just a quick note on that. Please don't see it as us as saying that you need to treat it that way. So one of the other big elements of motivational interviewing is that it's tied really closely to the stages of change. Stages of change were not actually developed directly as a piece of motivational interviewing, but they're really closely integrated in. And so we'll see that in some of our case studies that we look at later, and you may end up having some questions later on about, you know, I've got a person who is really, really circling around one of these particular areas, and how is it best for me to be able to help them maybe move from this particular location to the other? And we'll talk a little bit about that, but you know, if we don't get enough to it, please hold on to those questions. So the first one is pre-contemplation. And pre-contemplation is that first stage where a person is really, there's no consideration of change. They're not thinking about whether or not they want to, for instance, if they're coming from homelessness, they're on the street. I've had some people that we've been doing engagement with for several years, and they do not want to come in. They are really established in their place. And it doesn't mean that we don't keep coming to see them. We keep offering options, we keep offering support, but they're not interested in that. And there are certain things that we want to consider and think through how we can continue to engage that person, but they're not there. Same thing can also happen with folks who are in the midst of their addiction. They're not ready to give up or even reduce some of their usage. Contemplation is the next stage, and motivational interviewing tends to be the most effective here. And within this stage, this is a point where somebody is really starting to consider, maybe I will take a step. Now, they haven't done it yet, but they're examining, are there current behaviors, and is there some of this risk-reward, or they're doing some of this cost-benefit analysis in their mind. Maybe not in the really clear technical sense, maybe they are, but they're trying to determine, should I make the change? Is there something that's helpful for me in doing this? Do I want to stop smoking? Maybe I can, I would save a lot of money, I would not have some of the health issues, I would stop I wouldn't be coughing as much, and on and on. But meanwhile, I really like it. It's really calming to me. It's very helpful. There's a ritual. And they're working through the ambivalence of that. And there's a lot of things that we can help to kind of elicit something at that point. And it's a lot about trying to determine what's going on in the decision-making process for them. Moving on into preparation is, at this point, they've actually committed to taking action. And this can end up being a really short amount of time, or sometimes preparation can last a while for somebody. Maybe they're getting all their ducks in a row for quite a bit to make that next step, but they're developing a plan. And this can be a place where we are setting up the steps for what that looks like for them. What are important? What do they need to support the ultimate plan of taking a change and walking that out for them, ultimately through action. The next step being there, and that's implementing the plan. How does that actually get walked out? How do we do that? Finally, maintenance is, how does it get sustained? So if, for instance, if we came back to the example of quitting smoking, how does a person still avoid that habit? And maybe it's putting something else in that in its place. So I know I have a good friend of mine who he would get antsy and fidgety with his hands, and he would go get an apple. And so then he had something, and he was like still kind of in a little bit of a routine, and there was ways in which he could still sustain the behaviors and also maintain them, but do something to prevent slipping back into what he had previously been doing. So then a few things to explore of what it looks like at the different stages of changes. So, and questions to think about with pre-contemplation. So we want to explore their concerns. What are some of the things that may stand in your way? What are your thoughts about changing X behavior? You are not ready to come into housing yet, or maybe you are not ready to give up the collection that eventually moves into hoarding. But what do you think about that? Why is this important to you? And then this helps kind of just assess, where are they at? How far away from the possibility of getting to contemplation are they? Because it could be, no, maybe they only just need a couple things, a little bit more of support, or maybe they're really pretty far and they need to spend a lot more time processing that. Again, kind of noticed before is that contemplation, this tends to be some of the best one of the best places for utilizing motivational interviewing. And the goal is really to help them move on to the next stage of that preparation and eventually implementation of the plan. And interventions have to match that person's current stage. And so we're not trying to impose a will. When somebody's at the pre-contemplative stage, we're not going to be telling them that, like, you need to do action here. You need to take these things through to, this is how you do that. No, it's more along the lines of like helping them to develop the motivation, the interest, the ways in which that will actually get them to have ownership around next steps.
I did want to, Matt reminded me of one situation where one of my previous counselors was very frustrated with one of the clients, and she came in my office one day and she's like, I just don't know what to do with this person. They are, they know they're not supposed to be drinking, and their PO is going to get them in trouble, and they continue, they continue to drink, and she was very frustrated. So the very first question I'd asked her was, well, does this person want to stop drinking? And she goes, well, yeah, no, they told me that they'll never live without alcohol. So there you go. So this person is most likely in pre-contemplation stage of change, and you are trying to impose an action or even preparation to do something about changing this behavior, where they don't see any issues with the current behavior. That's where the friction becomes. And talking about resistance, so the more you push on, let's say, the action stage, the more you say, come up with a plan together, let's try this, let's figure out ways to cope with triggers. When the person isn't really ready to give up or stop engaging in that particular behavior, you're really going to get nowhere with that person. All right, actually this spills right into the pushing for change, or what we, many of us know as the right-in reflex. This is the innate drive to want to fix things, to want to help people, to advise, to teach, and argue for resolution of somebody's ambivalence. This is our desire, and many of us as social workers, human service workers, do want to help improve and better someone's life. So we're automatically kind of driven to, okay, we see a problem, this needs to be fixed. In order for this person to get housed, all they got to do is move into an apartment and they're going to be set. So we automatically seem to scan, so to say, the area, identify problems that need to be fixed, and we're ready to fix them. So this is what motivational interviewing refers to as the right-in reflex. You really want to avoid this. As much as you want to help someone and make someone's life better, you really want to avoid the right-in reflex if you are practicing motivational interviewing. The harder that you push for argument for change, the harder that you say, you know what, drinking again might get you a DUI. Isn't it a good reason to stop drinking? Or living another winter on the streets, making it through another winter might really, really get to your health. Isn't your health important to you? Like, posing those questions, they're really going to raise that wall, and the person is most likely to argue for why they don't want to change that particular behavior. So just a quick kind of, not really an example, but a scenario. Imagine a person who is the right-in reflex person, and they run into a person who's pretty ambivalent. And the ambivalent person may share the dilemma. They might say, you know what, I do want to get into an apartment, I want to get housed, I'm tired of living on the streets, but I'm not sure if I can even contemplate that. I'm not sure if that's something that's really going to benefit me in the long run. So you clearly can see this person is pretty ambivalent about the idea of moving into an apartment. The right-in reflex instinct immediately is going to start looking for actions, looking for the change. How can we make this happen? So if you're the type that's going to skip over working with that person to help them overcome the ambivalence, if you skip over that part and immediately start offering solutions, you really are very likely to get anywhere with this person. Some of the questions, I guess if you do catch yourself asking these types of questions frequently, you are most likely working with a right-in reflex. So something to keep in mind, for example, why don't you just sign up for treatment? Treatment is going to fix everything for you. Or why can't you just go to your appointments on your own? These kind of questions are, I would say, like traps, and you do want to avoid asking them. And if you ask, why don't you want to change, that particular question is most likely going to evoke a talk. The client is most likely going to say to you the reasons they don't want to change, when you actually want to get reasons why they want to change a particular behavior. So right-in reflex, do want to avoid that.
So once we think about some more with how can we elicit some of that change talk, there's there's a few reasons why this is really helpful. Some of it is developing some of the discrepancy in between where a person might be interested, what they would like to do, what are some of their goals, where they would like to be. So for instance, if a person is setting some sort of priority around their wellness, their health, their connection to family, but it's not a direct link to saying that I want to have housing, or I want to maintain my place in a cleaner way. This might not be as clear, but helping them to develop where's the discrepancy, where are these things that it might make it really difficult to do the one if the other is contradictory to that. And it's okay to kind of bring that up, not in a confronting way, but in saying, like, I'm holding this. What does this look like? It looks like, oh, well, there's this thing over here, but that might also butt up against, you know, you would love to be able to have your grandson come over and visit you, but when you have all of the accumulation of all of your takeout containers all the time, your daughter does not feel comfortable with the level of messiness in your apartment and roaches, and won't bring him by. So how can we develop those, or how can we maybe work on that and then elicit the change? It's not a judgment. It's just noting the discrepancy in between those things. And then if there's a person, if they're able to articulate that ambivalence, or saying, well, there's maybe something about this, or I don't know, I'll work that through, that's where change often becomes possible. And, you know, as discrepancy increases, as there's a difference in between the actual either behavior or the way that it's manifested, ambivalence ends up increasing. And then that moves further towards the direction of change. A direct quote often from motivational interviewing is, when behavior comes into conflict with a deeply held value, it's usually the behavior that changes. So there's something about a value that a person wants to maintain. Even if it's a matter of, I would like to be able to maintain more, I want more control over my money. But if their spending of their money is chaotically always going towards substance use, how can we help empower that value of the control towards those things? There's the point of being able to focus and empower them around that type of a thing. Oops, there we go. A few other things to think about within eliciting change talk. So oftentimes we're thinking about how speech then reflects the movement towards change. We're recognizing some of these patterns, and also recognizing when there's pushback about resistance. So if there's ways where both a person is saying, I'm open to these ideas, but then also where they're pushing back, and you roll with them. Similar to what we were talking about earlier, you know, if somebody is not willing to go there with this particular thing, okay, I get that. That makes sense. I understand why that would bother you. And instead, know how to recognize where each goes, how that one may be a barrier and one may be an open door. And sometimes there's something about us that we just end up playing a role in those things. That participant feels like that we are contributing to this. There's something about, you know, it could just be a dynamic, could be a past relationship or a past way in which we interacted with them. But we need to think those things through and try and approach it in the most respectful way as possible. And sometimes it's best to just call it out. Like say, you know, at one point I reacted to you in this way. I'd like to restart. I apologize for the way that that went. Let's try again. And then give them the opportunity to kind of hand the reins or hand them the steering wheel to restart. So again, that's kind of like what would help you make this change too. So we're asking them about that and being specific, of course. These are really general questions, so I'm not applying it in a really I'm not applying it to a very specific situation, but what would help you to make this particular change? Not why wouldn't you change? And there's something negative about that too. So that's kind of implying already that this person couldn't or doesn't want to or isn't interested. More along the lines, what would help you? You are already, I know that you're interested in this or that this is in your best interest, because there's something about this that you've already kind of brought out, especially if you're already recognizing some of that ambivalence or the discrepancy. And then how can you go about it in order to exceed? How can we support you? How can I support you along those lines, especially if that's recognizing that all of those things are already coming out from them. One of these questions that I really love too is, what 3 reasons do you have for making this change? You know, it might be a family motivation, it might be for their own well-being, their own good, it could be for a variety of other things, but then it's, this doesn't just restrict it to a single thing, and that could help you branch off in a whole variety of other ways. Help me figure out what are these types of things, and it's very open-ended in that sense. You also want to help them develop an argument for change, like that these are their own arguments, that they're kind of arguing on their own behalf. Not that you're arguing against them, but that they're making the argument to say that, all right, I'm interested in wanting to do this. I want to take that step. One way that we can do this is spending less time focused on just our questions, but we're doing as much listening, taking a guess at what are, not just taking a guess, but taking a guess at what your client or participant, person that you're working with is saying, and then deliver that back to them. You can try to put yourself in their frame of mind and expressing that to them so that they know, one, that they're being heard, and that you're doing it, that you're adequately following what they're expressing. One of the best rules to follow with this is to try and offer 2 reflections for every question that you ask. So the more we kind of machine gun somebody with questions or just pepper them with these things, the more likely that they're going to feel like that we're coming at them. But instead, if we can offer a reflection and twice as many reflections, that we're really showing that we are listening to them, and we're going to look at some opportunities or ways in which this is demonstrated a little bit later once we get to our case studies.
So the motivational interviewing in general is kind of divided into 2 phases. The first phase, phase 1, being focused on building the intrinsic motivation, and then phase 2 is kind of more directed at increasing someone's commitment to change. So during the work in phase 1, that is when we're really focused on increasing the person's intrinsic motivation, not external motivations, we really want to be assessing the importance and confidence of that person's like readiness to change. So one of the tools that is really cool, really simple, and you can modify this based on the individual that you are working with to simplify it if you need to. So this ruler called Readiness Ruler is really a cool tool to use to assess, 1, the importance of this change, and then the person's confidence level, whether or not, how confident do they feel that they can succeed in this change. So you would basically ask them to rate. Let's say they are in contemplation, and they're even pre-contemplation. They're there to, let's say you ran into them during outreach and it's really cold outside, and this is a good opportunity to elicit the change talk. So you may want to kind of bring up, or they might even bring up the idea of getting into an apartment or being warm, right, instead of being on the street. So one good way that you would probably want to ask, like on a scale from 0 to 10, for instance, if you had a scale, 0 being not important at all, and then 10 being extremely important, how important would it be for you to get into an apartment? And that person is going to give you a number. It might be a 3, it might be a 5, or even 7. So you will see the higher the number, the more importance there is, right? So once you get that number, it gives you a general idea of the motivation level of this person to want to get into an apartment. The other question you would ask is, well, how confident are you that you can actually get into an apartment and keep this apartment or remain housed once we house you? And that person might say, oh, I am really at number 2. I don't know if I have any skill. I mean, I don't know if I have any skills to pay the bills. I don't know how to pay rent, or I've never, for the past 10 years, I haven't been inside an apartment, so I don't even know if I could actually sleep in an apartment. So their confidence level might be different, significantly or a little less significantly different from the importance level. So from here, what you'll get is really 4 different profiles, so to say. So you'll be able to assess if the person fits in the profile of low importance and low confidence. You really have to do a lot of work and focus on increasing the importance level first on that one. Because if it is not important to the person to change, to make this particular behavior change, working on the confidence is really not going to make a whole lot of sense. So with the B profile, where there's low importance and high confidence, the interventions and the approach that you're going to utilize is going to be, again, different, right? For someone who has a very low importance, it might look like this. I don't believe that quitting smoking is important to me. It's 0. It's not important to me at all, but the confidence might be a completely different number. They might say, yeah, if I decided to quit smoking, I could easily do it, so my confidence is like 9, right? So there, you're going to be informed to what kind of interventions and what focus you're going to really heavily put on the importance level, because your goal at that point is to raise the importance level because the person is pretty confident. Going to the next, the C, high importance, low confidence. Again, it's extremely important for me, like it's a 9 that I stop smoking before I kill myself. And the confidence, I can't do it. I tried it many times. I've never been able to last more than a day, so I know I can't do it. Now you're really kind of more working on helping this person go into a phase 2, the increase in the commitment and then the preparation, making a plan on how and working on skills. And I would say the easiest part out of all these is the high importance and high confidence, which doesn't, we don't encounter that very frequently when working with the homeless population. One thing to really, we do want to like ask more follow-up questions, and these are designed to elicit the change talk that we are going to talk about the change talk in a little bit. You do want to kind of inquire with curiosity. How come it's not, if someone says, yeah, the importance of me moving into an apartment is 5, you do want to inquire, well, how come you didn't rate it at 3, or how come it's not a 0? You really basically want to explore why isn't it a lower number. This helps facilitate change talk because the person is likely to respond, well, it's not a 0 because I know that I'll be safe in an apartment. I know that when it's really cold out, I can go in there and stay warm. So it'll give you reasons. The person will give you reasons that they really believe that they could make this change. Don't ask for why the number isn't a higher one. So you don't really want to kind of ask, well, how come it wasn't rated at number 7? How come getting into an apartment is not a number 7 for you? Because this really is going to elicit what we call a resistance talk, not a change talk, because their response most likely will be something like, well, it's not a 7 because I can still make it out here. Without an apartment, I've lived under this bridge for 2 years and I made it fine. So that's why it's not a 7. So as you see, that particular talk is more like a resistance talk. One thing that I think will help you kind of inform the follow-up approach would be like asking what would it look like for you to go from 5 to a 7, for instance? What would it take for you to increase the importance level or the confidence level of moving into an apartment? If you rate it at 5, what would it take to get it to a 7? Now you're again eliciting the change talk that we are going to talk about in a little while.
So I know that when you had your relatively recent other training on motivational interviewing, you did briefly touch on some of these other methods that I'm going to get into here. To some degree, we're going to talk a little bit more about it, and I think that we'd be remiss to leave them out entirely, though you've discussed them before. They are very basic, and they're a big piece to any sort of the helping professions, but it's still very, very important that we bring them up, especially as we're talking about motivational interviewing. And they fit into the ORS acronym. So they are open-ended question, affirmation, reflective listening, and summarizing. So I'm going to look a little bit more in depth on each of them here, and then again we'll use some time to practice them later. So with open-ended questions, you're trying to, and it's actually funny, we put a couple things that are not necessarily questions on them, but you could categorize them as questions. These are really not the yes/no questions or the give me a even if it's the scaling question. That's not an open-ended question. That's helpful for some things, but it's not open-ended. You're not going to elicit someone's open response, and you're also going to have it be that folks are much less likely to elaborate. So things like, tell me what it's like to live on the streets. What was it like for you? Or what did you experience when you were out there? How's it been different since you moved into your place? And what else would you like to see change now that you've made this shift? What are some of your thoughts about getting an apartment? Or what has it been like for some of your friends or other people that have made that change? What are some important reasons you may want to see the psychiatrist? And, you know, there is something that's a little bit loaded in that question. What are some important reasons you may want to see the psychiatrist? But that might also be a response to the person of like them saying like that they may have suggested that there's something about that. So again, you're trying to elicit and follow where a person has already led you. Tell me about the challenges you encountered when you ended up homeless. What was that like previously? And again, I'm always kind of trying to connect that into what is it like now? How has that shifted? Where are you at this point, and how can we continue to help you along those particular pathway, I guess, as we do. Affirmation is really so this person feels like that not only have they shared something, but that they've shared it and you appreciate the fact that they've given it to you. So someone tells you something, or oftentimes people share just such difficult or really complicated, hard things about their story. And our folks have faced so much trauma. They've really had to battle to survive. And so thanking them for sharing these little things, it can be really basic, but it also always acknowledging and like somebody being willing to share when it's much more involved and affirming that. Thank you for agreeing to come in today. I know that that was probably pretty complicated, or, you know, I'm really glad that you took some time to sit down and talk with me. I know you got a lot of things that are going on. Things like, I must say, if I was in your position, I don't know if I would have managed to survive. Like, that really, really is really complicated. You're really resourceful. You've done amazing at this point. Helping that person feel like that you're impressed with what they've done. And so, you know, always be thinking about ways that you can continue to affirm them in their process. Reflective listening, we've talked about this a little bit again, but it's a big piece within these four components. Reflective listening, of course, is, you know, coming back, and this defines it again, but we want to be trying to make sure that we're offering this opportunity to get into their frame of mind and clarifying that we do have it accurately, that we're accurately coming from their perspective. I heard somebody even just in our office today, as I was in my office, someone reflected back to them and they said, no, that's not at all what I was trying to say. And then that gives us the opportunity to try again. Or like, okay, I'm sorry I didn't interpret that right. Can you help me figure it out a little bit better? And then this is actually, we had gotten a question that was submitted to us earlier about a person who always seems to be in crisis, and that they feel as though they're always really upset, always distraught. And you may have felt that you are just trying to offer everything to them. And this person just says, no one knows how to help me. No one will be there for them. And, you know, I would continue to say that a great place for using reflective listening is or this would be a great opportunity to do that, to reflect back about, like, you know, I am so sorry that this is happening to you. Kind of along those lines of affirmation again, but then reflecting back of what is going on in their life. That is so hard. I'm so sorry that this keeps going on. Wow, like, let me understand this correctly. And if there is any point or anything that I can do to help in this situation, or can we talk about this any further? Can we process that? I want to be here for you. I want to be available. What can we do? And that person may continue to focus on it. They may really struggle, but continuing to reflect, continuing to make yourself available is so incredibly important. A few things to note what is not reflective listening. These are things like ordering, directing, or commanding. So when somebody then comes and tells you, you know what I think? I think that you just need this, or you should follow through on these next steps. The other thing then too would be something like warning or threatening. Now, this is a little bit different than when maybe we come into boundary setting and someone is in crisis and we need to set some limits for them. But that's not threatening. That's trying to say, here's potential consequences of, I would love to be able to meet with you. I would love to be able to do this, but we can't yell at people, or we can't threaten staff today. Maybe we can try again tomorrow. That's not threatening. That's not warning them in a punitive sort of way. It's more just like, this is where this stands. I'd love to be able to come back. And it's, again, still much more on that positive perspective. just giving advice or providing solutions, especially when somebody's at they're not necessarily seeking those things, or you may have the opportunity to elicit that. You're trying to find those solutions that already exist with them, but they're just saying, tell me what to do. What do I do in this thing? How do I do that? Or what would you do? And then, but instead, trying to come back to it with some questions to reflect back of like, well, what did you do before? What did you think about how you responded to that? What might you do different this next time? Telling people what they should do, and then doing it from, especially in a moralizing perspective, noting that, well, this is the right thing to do, or this is what, this is what my great Aunt Faye would have told me to do, and sometimes everybody's got that person that is really important to them, and that may be a value for that particular person, but when we're imposing those morals onto that particular person, they might not share those things too, and so that can end up becoming a barrier or a really complicated thing to deal with later. Reflective listening is definitely not judging, criticizing, or blaming a person, saying, well, you did this or that. And we're going to look at an example of non-motivational interviewing conversation in a moment. It's not shaming. People have dealt with so much shaming, but sometimes we feel like, well, this is an effective thing. That's going to push them in through the next step. All that really does is put that person into a further barrier, and you're not going to be able to develop that really important therapeutic alliance later. Just outright agreeing, approving, and praising the person without the rest of the questions. So this is an important distinction. If you are just agreeing, all right, you're right, I get that, and then just leaving it there, approving all the time and just, wow, that's it, that's not helpful. More along the lines of like there needs to still be a confirmation or a conversational aspect of all of this.
I did want to add to the audience question about this client who's constantly screaming and yelling at them and keeps saying that no one can help you. Like, how do you best approach that person? The most important thing in your work with clients is the relationship that you develop with clients. Without that connection, without that trust and relationship, no interventions, no treatment approaches are going to be effective, because the person has to be able to trust you. The person has to know that you do have their best interest in mind. So I think when a person is screaming, yelling, and refusing whatever services you're offering and saying no one can help you, I think it's really important to acknowledge and validate what they've been through. We do have a lot of people who go through the system multiple times before we get to work with them, and understandably, and unfortunately, their experiences haven't been the best. So I think it's really important to not discount what they went through, especially going back like a few years ago, 10 years ago, there still is a lot of stigma attached to being homeless. There's a lot of stigma attached to drinking, substance use, and mental illness. So I think kind of, again, going back and putting yourself in that person's shoe, what would it be like for you if you were the one who had went through the system multiple times and no one probably really helped that person, and now you do have the best intentions to help them and you do want to help them, but because the bridges were burned, so to say, with other systems, they're not really open to you. So you do want to acknowledge, and that's done by simply stating, I'm really sorry that you went through that. I understand it must be really hard for you to make it, to be in the system or to encounter social services. I've heard lots of people complain about them, so validating those feelings is extremely important. One concrete question that you could ask is when they say no one can help me, I would probably ask them, if someone was to help you, what would that look like? That way, this particular question is really going to help elicit or start that change talk that we're looking for. So jumping back to the source, and the summary part of it is kind of the finalizing part of the source. So ORS, sorry, ORS, Matt is correcting me. So summarizing is basically wrapping up. The summary could be done throughout the dialogue. Let's say maybe every 10 minutes or so you want to summarize, and again, going back to making sure that you are understanding what the client is saying, that you are both on the same page, right? So summary, just saying simply, so this is what I hear you say so far, this is what we've discussed, what else? Like asking that what else also helps kind of facilitate or continue that change talk. The client might add, yeah, also living on the streets, I get robbed all the time. Okay, so I hear you say that you are cold, you don't really eat very well, you get robbed a lot when you live on the streets. What else? So again, elicit the change talk. Encourage the person to keep going and draw together the change talk. It's kind of what I just talked about. There are kind of different types of summarizing. Linking summary is when you connect something that the client told you earlier to what's happening now. Maybe last week when you did outreach, that client might have said to you, I really could use a warm space to warm up for a few hours, or a safe place to sleep. And today when you're doing outreach and you ran into the same client, they might be completely saying, because the weather is nicer, they might not even consider going into a shelter or an apartment. You might want to kind of link back what they said to you a week ago and say, hey, remember you said this last week, how's that going today? Where do you stand on that today? That particular thing is going to help clarify the ambivalence, because what is ambivalence? It's wanting to do something different, but kind of reverting back to the old way of thinking and saying, no, I really don't want to do anything different. I'm pretty fine where I am. I'm pretty complacent with where I'm at. So that's what the linking summary does. And transitional summary is kind of shifting the focus from one to another. When you might have talked about getting into an apartment, and then you do want to summarize that particular dialogue and shift to, you might say something like, I also heard you mention that your leg sores have been pretty brutal for the past couple weeks. Is there anything that you would, you want to explore on that? Like kind of offering the shift and going back to what the client had told you before works really well. We thought that we'd draft some questions, and kind of they follow a certain routine, like some questions that are designed to help evoke the change talk that we're talking about. Again, Matt was talking about open-ended questions. When you want to ask open-ended questions, and if you want to elicit change talk, kind of ask questions about the disadvantages of the current behavior. That is like asking, what worries you about your current situation? What are some of the things that that happened to you that you didn't really like in this current situation? What do you think will happen if you don't change, or if you don't go into an apartment? What do you think it'll happen if you don't see your doctor as scheduled? Like asking kind of focusing more on disadvantages of the current behaviors, but not really pushing change or being accusatory, but very kind of laid back, open-ended questions, important to ask. The other theme you can ask questions on is the advantages of change. This is kind of more focused on helping the person see what would be the pros of making this change happen. Again, that same person who constantly screams and yells and says no one can help, asking them what would it look like if someone did help you? That is eliciting change talk. What would your life look like in 5 years? Or even if you don't want to go that far, it can be 2 years from now or next month. What would this look like for you? What would be the advantages of making this change? Those are kind of the questions, open-ended. Again, you want to ask. The theme is advantages of change. You do want to kind of assess the optimism about change also. What encourages you that you can change if you want to? Like, this is more also kind of assessing the confidence level about changing the particular behavior. What do you think would work for you if you decided to change? Again, we're kind of assessing the optimism about change. They might say, I really want to get housed. I really want to keep an apartment. But answering that last question, what do you think would work for you if you decided to change? They might say, you know what, it would help me if I had a case manager who would make sure that I pay my bills on time. We're talking now, this is a change talk that's happening, right? More on optimism about change, who could offer you support. That would be either a family member. Whatever they say is really something that we have to acknowledge and work with. What strengths do you have to help you succeed? As we know, people who live on the streets, every person has tons of strengths. Some people don't know that they have them, they don't utilize them, and it is our job to kind of help them recognize that these strengths are there. And going back to what we were talking about earlier, every person's self-efficacy is something that we believe in when we do motivational interviewing. Again, intentions. How important is this to you, and how much do you want to do this? Basically, you're kind of eliciting change talk and also assessing at the same time that importance level, the commitment to change. What are you thinking about drinking at this point? A simple question, but they will elicit a change talk. Very straightforward question, but not confrontational. So what do you intend to do? The person might say, yeah, because I want to get into an apartment, I'm actually going to come into the local shelter and complete the application that is required of me to do. So the questions that we ask will elicit responses. If you ask closed-ended questions, the responses are going to be yes, no, maybe, I don't know. If you do ask non-judgmental, open-ended questions, the answers are going to be more like change talk and move forward type of answers.
I'm not going to spend much time here, but this is kind of a quick note on thinking about when we have someone's values. This is coming back to Psych 101, and we probably could have started with this, but when someone has their own personal hierarchies of where their focus or their own values lie, a good place to start is looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and they may end up looking at where that's more physiological, safety, love and belonging, et cetera, and all of that. And it might actually just be a really good, helpful tool, though, to bring this out. I think sometimes we ignore it just because it's so basic and simple, but this quote that we grabbed here, you make every decision according to your hierarchy of values. The values of what's important to you, of what's setting out this sets the course for your life, and the whole focus of motivational interviewing is to try and help a person determine where those values are, and then sort out next steps together with them. One last element of summary before we move on to the case studies is, motivational interviewing facilitators, what we do is that we lead conversational sessions that are collaborative, they're non-judgmental, they focus on strengthening clients' own motivation and commitment to change. The focus or the emphasis is engagement. So establishing a helpful relationship, understanding barriers and reasons to change, focusing, so identifying the change area and setting an agenda. Evocation, eliciting the client's motivation to change and building their self-efficacy. And planning, so developing a commitment to change and then formulating an action plan. So if you are utilizing each of those elements, then you are able to then do motivational interviewing. So you are all experts now. You're going to be able to do that in multiple amazing ways, and all of Pennsylvania is going to be changed, which you likely all were incredible experts on it anyway, and we were just reviewing it, so we appreciate that. We're going to spend some time a little bit on some case studies here. What we're going to do, we're going to try this, where we're going to hand it back and forth and do a dialogue, but these are a little bit of a composite of some participants in folks that we've worked with and we've supported here. So I'm going to read you the scenario, and then we'll do some dialogue. First one here, we actually use some dialogue that's non-motivational interviewing focused, and then the next part is going to be focused on more motivational interviewing, or the next three will use some more motivational interviewing focused dialogue. So John is a 55-year-old Caucasian male who's been drinking alcohol since 13. He's always said that alcohol was part of his identity and could not live without using it. He tells you his health is important to him and that he wants to be involved in his daughter's life. His doctor told him to stop drinking if he wanted to live longer than 5 years. His daughter told him that as long as he is drinking, she wanted nothing to do with him. John states that lately he has been thinking about quitting drinking, but he can't imagine living without alcohol. So again, to start, and noting here, we're cheating a little bit. We're giving you the stage to change on this person. We're not going to give you the stage on the other two, but using this non-motivational dialogue here. I'm going to be John. Oksana is going to be the worker. My daughter turned 29 yesterday, and I couldn't even go to see her. I'm such a loser.
Well, you know what you have to do if you want to see her.
What's that?
Well, she told you a million times that as long as you drink, and she'll want nothing to do with you. Don't you remember her saying that to you?
Yeah, I remember what she told me. I tried not drinking yesterday, but I just couldn't resist it.
Maybe you didn't try hard enough. I know when people really put their minds to do something, they can do it. Where there's a will, there is a way.
If it's that easy for other people and I couldn't even last half a day, something must be wrong with me. I'm such a loser, just like my mom told me I was. So very not focused on some of these positive affirmations. It's very directive. It's giving advice. There's a judgment that's based in a lot of the dialogue. Let's try something that's more motivational interviewing focused. So again, John here. My daughter turned 29 yesterday and I couldn't even go see her. I'm such a loser.
It sounds like you're really upset that you didn't get to see your daughter. What got in the way of you seeing her?
My drinking. I couldn't see her. I remember she told me I couldn't see her if I was drinking. I really want to see her, but I'm not ready to give up alcohol.
Oh, I see. On the one hand, I hear you say that your daughter is important to you. On the other hand, I hear you say that you're not ready to give up drinking.
You just can't imagine. Drinking has always been part of me.
What would help you stop drinking?
My daughter's the biggest reason. I would see her regularly, and I know that drinking is killing my liver. So I would be in a better shape without alcohol.
If you were to decide to stop drinking, how confident you'd say that you could succeed at it? What number would you rate it on the confidence ruler?
I guess I'm thinking at 3.
And this is considering that the social worker and John had already went over the confidence ruler, and John is aware of what that means. That's why there's no introduction to it in the dialogue here. But as you can see, there's a huge contrast here in the dialogue that goes on between the social worker and John, where the social worker's responses to John's statements actually elicit the change talk that we really wanted to see happen, where she says, what would help you stop drinking? And he goes on to state reasons why he really should change his particular behavior.
Obviously, we wrote this dialogue, and John could have just said, I don't want anything to do with you, and just gone on and on in other ways. But what we wanted to see, what we wanted you to see instead is more along the lines of the kinds of things that a person who was trying to elicit and evoke some of that change language could say, or that they could bring up in that type of a situation. And maybe in your questions or in the time that we're going to reflect in a couple minutes here, you also could note, like, maybe there's some things that are missing from this, or if you could try a different strategy, or what are some of the other things that you might reflect on that could look differently. We're going to move on to another case study here, and this is Michaela. So Michaela had been engaged for years before she came into housing about 3 months ago. She more or less sees her apartment as a storage unit to drop off her ever-increasing collection of things like books and other items, smoke cigarettes, and sleep at night. Her landlord complains to you and regularly about the sanitation issues and smells coming from the apartment. She does not express any interest in reducing these behaviors. She has said she likes being in away from the cold and doesn't like the threat of being hassled by cops or having her stuff stolen while on the street. So you are the worker? Yeah. Or the worker.
Oh, the worker.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm going to be Michaela then.
Okay.
That landlord better not come and get on my case anymore. I don't know why he's got it out for me.
Wow, that sounds really stressful for you. It seems like the things he says really bother you.
Darn skippy it does. He doesn't know what it's like for a person like me.
I bet not. No one knows what it's like to be you. How have things been different for you since you've been in your apartment?
Well, I don't like people like you coming around all the time, but at least I don't have to move from place to place.
That makes a lot of sense. I appreciate you being honest with me about that. I'm sorry. I'd love to work out a way to help you deal with the stress that you talked about with your landlord, but also have your own freedom. What do you think would be best to do first?
I don't know. He complains about the way I keep my place, but he doesn't live here. I do. It should be up to me. I want to keep it how I want to keep it.
I get that. It bothers you when he's saying what's what. On one hand, I hear you say he should leave you be as it is, but on the other hand, you're also saying that you want to keep your place. How might these be at odds?
So obviously, again, this is just a snapshot. This is a picture of a conversation in the middle of it, and it's not bookended with one place before or after. But I wanted you to see more along the lines of what a person may be kind of along the more of a pre-contemplative. Michaela here is not interested in changing the behaviors, things like reducing things that are going on within our apartment. But the worker is taking some opportunity to elicit some of those opportunity for change. What are some of the values that she has? What are ways that we can attach to those and then move it to the next stage? All right, let's go to our last case study. So Francis has been housed for 2 years and has recently had a probation violation for drug possession. He's been steady maintaining his stated goals of sobriety up until recently when he let his cousin stay in his unit. The cousin brought a handful of issues related to his own addiction back into Francis' life. On a recent home visit, Francis tells you he wants help figuring out how to get his cousin out of his apartment and set some boundaries so he doesn't get sent back to jail. I've got to figure this out. I can't deal with the stress of all this. It's too much.
Man, Francis, this is a lot to deal with. You seem to want to take steps, though. What do you do different if you could set up a plan?
I get the drugs out of my house for one, plus I probably need to get some distance with me and my cousin, which is tough because he's always been there for me.
I hear that. Family and loyalty is important to you. At the same time, so is staying out of jail and keeping your place. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I got to do it, even if it sucks.
It really is hard, but it's a big deal for you to recognize what's important for you and commit to it too. Where do you think you want to be in 5 years with your relationships with your cousin?
I'd love to set some distance now, but be able to come back after that time. Hopefully when we both get our lives together.
Sounds like a great plan, Francis. You really are determined. Let's talk about how you want to make this work.
Again, I know that these can end up feeling really canned, and they're really difficult to put them in just in a snapshot. But I want you to see ways in which to demonstrate some of these skills here. Last thing, in fact, actually, do you want to just, this is your.
I do love this particular quote. I think it says a lot about, and going back to the very beginning of this presentation when we said that motivational interviewing is more a philosophical belief that you have rather than a set of techniques. This kind of captures it all in one. If you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change, meaning, hey, if that client is being resistant, that means there's something you're not doing enough of or you're doing too much of that's causing that wall to go up. So really, instead of kind of blaming the client or looking at what's wrong with the client, why is this not working, what are they not doing enough, really look at yourself and find a way to elicit that change talk.
I'm going to challenge Oksana too, is that client is not being resistant, that they're displaying resistant behaviors. So we're always trying to find, and we do this back and forth all the time. I tell all of our staff, please, by all means, feel free to challenge me when I'm not using person-centered language. There's a really important aspect in how we can do this as a culture. And so anyway, that's another important piece in all this. We do want to be able to move on to having some questions, some comments, and get some of your feedback about how this is done, how you've utilized these types of things. We may have some crickets here, but I'd love to hear from you, you know, examples of how this has worked, or maybe how it hasn't worked, how you've struggled with this type of a thing with your own participants out across the whole state. So I believe Brandon is going to be helping us with, he's our host, is going to be helping us with some of the questions that may be typed to him. Okay, good. So we've got some questions here. Let me pull them up. All right, good.
Where do you see these questions, Matt? Are they? I see there's one in the Q&A box.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see? Do you see any more?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
I've got one question here. So, how do you work with someone to overcome the ambivalence? Do you want to? Yeah.
A really good question. So, I think really remember what ambivalence is. For someone who's kind of sitting on that fence, how do you help them get onto the right side of the fence? And the right side is not my opinion, it's the client's, right? So one thing that you would have to do a lot of that reflective listening and develop that discrepancy, which means you would have to ask questions like, so I'm hearing you say that you want to get into an apartment, but I'm also hearing you say that your independence is extremely important to you. So that particular question or the reflective statement is going to help you elicit a change. You can even ask a question. So what would it look like what would your independence look like if you did get into an apartment? Ask that question, and they probably will say, well, I would still be able to come in and out of an apartment anytime I wanted to. I could come home if it's really cold outside. So that particular dialogue is, you're evoking that change talk that we want to hear. And the more of that change talk is done, the less the ambivalence become, and the stronger the stance or the belief that this person is going to get on the right side of the fence is going to happen. With the ambivalence and discrepancy that we talked about earlier, sometimes people say, I want to save $1,000, like people who we house, and they have, they have very limited income, but they want to save money, and they make this goal, and we want to support them in that. But then next week they come in and say, I want to buy this $200 item. You want to support that, right? But this is the place to engage in this dialogue of using that Lincoln summary that I talked about, reminding them, oh, last week you came in, I remember you told me that you wanted to save $1,000 by the end of next month, and right now you want to take $200. Is that right? Like, kind of bringing it back to them and helping them see that there is something kind of off. There is a discrepancy in what you said you wanted to do and what's really happening now. It may work. They might not get it right away, but the idea is really be persistent with it and supportive and not accusatory and throw it back at them. Matt, do you want to add stuff to this?
One thing that I just add too is just around really trying to highlight the pros and cons too, like of where somebody is saying, like defining what would be the pros and cons of making this particular change. What would be the risks? Why in doing this? And then what would be the benefits? The pros and cons again, and then highlighting and emphasizing the pros. Why would that be helpful for you? Why do you think that you would benefit from the ways in which this is helpful or supportive? And that's one way to help make that step past ambivalence. So, other questions?
Matt, there's two in the Q&A box. I'll read the first one off. This is from Scott.
Great.
How effective do you find the motivational interviewing method in your personal experience?
Did you hear it, Oksana, too? I think that it's been incredibly helpful for the participants that we work with. I do think that there's a good amount of research and support to say that this is a really great intervention, especially for a particular group of individuals. But in our own personal work, I think that this has become really natural in just the basic way in which I end up doing interventions, interactions with our participants on a regular basis. And I think that it's really helpful. It does end up becoming incremental sometimes. It does end up like it takes time. It requires patience. You know, when you are expecting, well, if I just give them the key and I just push them through that door, all I got to do is all I got to do is open it up and then give them the shove. Then they're through it. It's good. Historically, a lot of our systems have done that, but unfortunately, that's not the way to sustain those efforts. And so what we do see is when we really effectively do these things and that we work through them on a regular basis and we're regularly returning to them, that we are much more likely to see those positive, but again, incremental changes. We're going to talk about it a little bit more once we get to our final session, but a quick note about one of the things that we've worked with in our, we've developed a new clinical team here at Pathways to Housing with working with individuals with opioid use disorder. And this is, for the most part, individuals with really severe heroin addictions who have been on the street for years and years, and these are folks who, you know, most other programs, if they've either failed to adequately support them or like that they've passed through them. And what we've seen is when we utilize things like motivational interviewing and continually standing with them and not just withdrawing our support and all of these other things, we've had, you know, about 50% of our participants are now engaging in medically assisted treatment. And this is after the first year and a half of the program. Now, granted, I'd love to see more and more people in that, and there's a lot more support that we can offer them, and we do a lot more in addition to that. But that's just a kind of a snapshot of using this kind of intervention with the group of folks that we serve. I'm going to hand this over to Oksana, as there's other ways in which she said that herself.
For me personally and professionally, motivational interviewing is very effective for two reasons. I really had to learn to respect the person's values, although they might be disagreeing with where I am. For instance, their choice to remain on the streets until they're ready to move in, that's something that can be very hard for me or another human being to conceptualize. And I hear people say, well, wouldn't their life be better if they just moved into an apartment? I mean, we're offering them an apartment, but it's not just all that. We also have to remember what is the value system of this individual consists of, that hierarchy of personal values, not the needs. We are kind of trained to immediately, again, this is the right-in reflex, to think, okay, safety first, physical safety, and then so forth, and work on the Maslow's hierarchy. But we really have to slow down and remember that every person that we work with has a unique set of values. So for me, respecting the person's choices and helping them really see what each of the choices may lead to is really all I can do with the motivational interviewing. It's something that it's basically you are this coach that is walking along the race line, but the client is the one that's actually running. You're just kind of giving them the little tips here and there to either speed up or slow down or make a turn. But I think, again, you have to buy into this belief. If you struggle with motivational interviewing in general, it's probably not something that you can easily sell to a client also. Do I see a question there?
Let's see. Okay. How do staff operating time-limited assistance or programs, for example, shelter or rapid rehousing programs, apply these practices? It feels like this process requires time to move through each phase, but providers are expected to move folks along as quickly as possible. It's a great question. And I think that there's still some ways in which where we can recognize how these things are demonstrated and where a person is at within their stage. And we can still have conversations related to those things and then elicit those conversations. And, you know, I did talk about that it does require patience, it requires incremental change at some point too, but if you do force a person into a change, there's less likelihood that they're going to embrace it themselves. But noting that, okay, what are you interested, what are you available to do at this point because we have a limited amount of time, and how can we work that out within this time frame? What are you interested in to do this because I only have this amount of space, and so still recognizing the parameters of the expectation within your agency or how you need to be able to offer the services that you do, you don't throw those things all out the window. That still should be a part of your decision-making process. It's a great question. Anything else that you would say on that too, Oksana? I believe we had another question too. Brendan, did you have one?
Yeah, this is from Leah. You have given a lot of information that may be fundamental shift in how staff interact with clients. Do you have any suggestions or tools that we can use in our agencies to practice these techniques? Are there any tools that measure how well a staff are doing?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Oksana, did you hear that? I'm sorry. So we've given a lot of information that might be pretty fundamental to a heavy shift for a lot of folks. So what might be some ways to help implement that or measure it on a wide level? And am I reflecting that accurately? Am I getting that clear? So what we're actually hoping to do is when we do the in-person training, and I know that that's going to be a little bit further along the line, we'd like to bring a toolkit of a handful of practical skills and further study and some other things, and so that might be a way to also do that. We don't have those immediately here available right now because we wanted to lay this as a foundation, but we'd love to be able to do that based on the in-person sessions that we're going to do with you. And then we can also talk about that a little bit of what it looks like individually for your organizations. I'd also love to hear at that level, you know, you can provide these questions maybe back to Lee, or we can also help consult on this if there are very specific questions for your own individual organizations or at a wider level where that'll look like. I hope that answers that question. Anything else?
I have another one from Bendu. Is motivational interviewing effective on those who suffer from severe mental illness?
So is motivational interviewing effective on those suffering from severe mental illness?
Originally, the motivational interviewing was designed for specifically to help change the behavior related to substance use. But as time went on and research was put into place, they discovered that actually it helps to change any behavior. For someone who has schizophrenia, for instance, you probably will have to modify the way you ask questions, but the concepts would be very similar. You would still use the same open-ended questions. If that client has, for instance, delusions that they are the president of the United States or they own the world, you do want to kind of frame questions being sensitive to those delusions. I think it works. I mean, there's research that says that it works to help change a behavior. Again, this is not, motivational interviewing is not a treatment for mental illness. It's really designed to help change a behavior and to help a person move from not being willing to change a behavior to wanting to change a particular behavior. So if you have a specific client in mind, we can elaborate on that, but it really is going to depend on the client that you work with, how you adjust the motivational interviewing questions and techniques.
Yeah, this has been something that I've utilized too with individuals with severe mental illness too, and especially when you are focusing in these areas, and you tailor it for that person, and using some of those different ORS techniques and how to help still give affirmation and reflecting and support. You know, sometimes it's really complicated when they are put through, you know, disorganized or some of those thought disorders and all that. But at the same time, like, you still are showing that you're developing this alliance, that you want to be working with them, and if you can hone in on a particular behavior or if there's a particular area of change, that's the main focus of using this. It's not, I would agree with Oksana that it's not designed to do just straight therapy or eliminate mental illness symptoms. It's more focused on the actual behavior change itself. Anything else?
I have another one from Paul. Is it a good idea to provide choices to clients to assist in leading to change when you provide aspects of both?
Is it a good idea to provide
choices to clients to assist in leading to change when you provide aspects of both?
Aspects. Yeah, I guess the both is what I'm trying to figure out, what aspects of change. Is Paul able to clarify that a little bit? I apologize. Aspects of change when I apologize if I'm not able to follow it completely, but I think that it is appropriate to offer as much of this as possible for anyone. It's really incredibly important to offer choices. And if, well, okay, so if that's the question, if it is trying to offer choices to someone, it's also trying to still elicit where their interest is. And so it could be educating still on those choices, but not eliminating, like, it is only just this, but where are their own interests within these things? Where are the possibilities? Maybe I'm clarifying myself adequately. Do you feel like maybe you can interpret me, Oksana, or your own stuff?
I just wanted to add to the options question, should we offer options, or can we, as a motivational interviewing approach? Yes, the motivational interviewing does welcome offering options and perspectives, but not imposing them. And the idea is that that client is the one that will ultimately make the choice. But before even going into offering options, I would probably want to ask that what else question to say, you know, you wanna stop drinking, for instance, and you have your family as your support, or you have these options to go about it. What else? Like, elicit even more options from the client themselves by asking that what else questions. That'll give you a lot more flexibility and will definitely help your relationship building with that client.
Cool, yeah. We're almost about up at time. Maybe we have enough space for about one or two more questions.
There's one more question that was sent to me. After helping someone several times with housing and watching them sabotage each housing situation, when do you say enough is enough?
Yeah, we're familiar with when something might look similar to that. It's really complicated to make a determination. One of the things that's really important about the Housing First fidelity measure, or the expectations around what happens within Housing First, is that there's no one single amount or saying that okay, they've hit this amount of apartments, or that there are these things that have occurred and they are not willing to make this change. We've had to wrestle with things like this in the past, and you know, we had a case conference this morning, actually, talking about a person who's been dealing with a lot of issues for years and years. And you know, ultimately where we came up with this morning is, what other strategies do we need to come up with this person? Maybe it's not, maybe we're not coming at this the right way, or maybe we need to draw in some other things. It's not just throwing up our hands, and I'm not saying that this person who's asking this question is saying that, but there's always a possibility for other options that are there. And occasionally we consider that the aspects of housing first is not for every single person too, although I would say that I think that it's really important and helpful for most people in these kinds of scenarios. And there's a lot of different strategies that we can utilize, and that you know, as much as we feel like that, like we've tried everything, or that there's nothing else under the sun that we could try, I'm always impressed when, okay, oh wait, there's something else here. There was something under that rock that we didn't turn over, and okay, we got a fresh perspective on this. I talked to somebody else, and they were able to offer a new option, or okay, we looked at a different thing that happened within this person's life, and we did not consider that the other time. So it's always just being open instead of trying to just close those doors. I know it's really hard when things continually happen. Is there anything else that you would add to that, Oksana? No? Okay, good. Lee, is there anything culminating or last things that you would like to say?
No, I think today was very helpful, and I submitted some questions to you, so thank you for responding to my questions as well. I will just let folks know that if questions after today sort of come to mind, we sent an email last week asking for folks to submit questions to our PA_COC@hotmail.com email address. Feel free to go ahead and respond to that email with any other questions, and we can pass those along to Matt and Oksana and ask them to address them during next week's webinar. You will also be receiving an email in a day or two asking if you have any questions that are specific to harm reduction, the theme of next week's webinar. So feel free to include questions, again, either related to this topic or next week's topic, and we'll make sure to forward them on. But thank you to both of you so much for your time today and for everybody on the line. And we look forward to reconvening next week. For folks who registered today, you do have to register for each webinar independently. So if you registered for today and that was it, you're not automatically registered for next week. The links are available on the training flyer that was distributed. I can repost that for folks who may have trouble finding it. So thank you to everyone. Talk to you next week.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Matt and Oksana.
And thank you to Brendan also. Thanks very much, Brendan, for your manning the webinar over there. I appreciate that.
My pleasure. And just so everyone knows, this was recorded. It will be posted eventually along with PowerPoint.
Terrific. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.